This is a story about a beautiful and wealthy couple, a young American named Joe and the Russian beauty, Olga. They got married and honeymooned in the Virgin Islands, enjoying the beaches and paradise. They didn't know that their marital bliss was on a timer, with only 107 days of happiness remaining. The Connell family lived in Wilmington, Delaware, USA. There were three children, but the parents divorced, impacting everyone. The kids, John, Joseph, and Kelly, stayed with their mother. Growing up, they were a lively bunch who often squabbled. As they matured, the siblings developed a strong bond. Their mother found a new partner who became a second father figure. The family lived comfortably, allowing them to grow up without wanting for anything. Joseph, known as Joe, became an enterprising man. He could be meticulous in business, but generally he was a jovial, fun-loving guy, the life of the party. Joe's business was thriving. He co-owned an auto service and store with his best friend, Christopher. During this period, Joseph met Olga, a young woman from Russia, online. Both were in their 30s, having experienced past relationship disappointments and seeking love. They quickly connected, drawn to each other's friendly and vibrant personalities. Joe, a confirmed bachelor, never imagined he'd find a blonde who would turn his world upside down. They began talking daily, spending hours online, and grew so close that she moved to the United States from Siberia. Joe wasn't disappointed when they met in person. He was captivated by Olga's beauty and gentle nature. The feeling was mutual. They started dating, and their relationship progressed quickly. Joseph's family quickly fell in love with the Russian beauty, who was inseparable from their son. She seemed gentle and vulnerable on the outside, but she was also energetic and resourceful. The whole family loved her, and she seemed to be the one who could make their middle son settle down. Of course, her arrival in America had a purpose. Joe promised to marry her, and the Connells planned a wedding. It was then that problems began. The first issue was the wedding ring. Tradition dictated that the mother of the family give a family heirloom to her son, but it was already with her daughter, Kelly. Kelly got married 10 years before these events, and her engagement ring was expensive, costing about $20,000 due to the diamond. Joseph took the ring, discreetly swapped the stones for phynites, and returned it to Kelly. The diamonds would be set in a new engagement ring for Olga and later swapped back. The plan was for no one to notice. The original plan was to return everything to Kelly, but that didn't happen right away. His sister did notice the difference in stones and wasn't happy. She expressed her outrage to her brother, who became upset. He felt that his sister wanted to break family traditions, and he got angry. The wedding took place in the Virgin Islands in the United States of America. However, his sister wasn't there because she was resentful and working. Still, she found time to send Olga some barbed messages about the engagement ring. The bride was unaware of Joseph's actions with the jewelry, and Kelly's rudeness spoiled the joy of the moment. Constant fights and arguments began between the brother and sister. Just weeks after the wedding, someone broke into the couple's home while they were at work. The intruder stole a lot of jewelry and family heirlooms. However, the Connell family's diamond ring was on Olga's finger, so it was saved. After discovering the home invasion, Joseph called the police. They inspected the scene but found no evidence. If the robbery wasn't staged, the perpetrator was a professional. However, they wouldn't solve the case. A much more serious crime was on the horizon. Tragically, they weren't destined to live happily ever after. Their life together began in the Virgin Islands, where they honeymooned after the wedding. They enjoyed each other, the sea, and the sun. The couple fished, sailed on a yacht, and enjoyed exquisite cuisine. They had plenty of money and enjoyed their wedding trip. Back home, the young Connell family acquired a new Mercedes convertible worth over $100,000. Joe afforded it because he co-owned a rapidly growing auto business. The business brought in about $1 million a year. Olga, a former stock trader, understood economics, finance, and client relations. She became part of her husband's business, working as an administrator. The attractive Russian blonde, with her accent, was friendly and helped the business grow. Everything was perfect until the day the unthinkable happened. On September 23, 2013, just 3 months after their wedding, gunshots rang out at their Wilmington home. Around 2 a.m., emergency services received a call. A witness reported a woman shot near a condominium in the Paladine Club apartment complex. She was still alive. Medics arrived within minutes and gave first aid to Olga, who had been shot multiple times. She suffered serious gunshot wounds and was bleeding. They rushed her to the hospital. Despite their best efforts, Olga died on the way to the hospital. While examining the crime scene, I discovered another body in addition to the first victim. Joseph was lying in the bushes, having been killed instantly by a gunshot to the back of the head. It didn't appear to be a random robbery attempt. Instead, the couple was returning home and had been purposefully ambushed from behind. Detectives had no problem piecing together all the circumstances and information they had. I realized that the previous burglary of their home could be linked to the tragic outcome that cut short the couple's happy love affair. Immediately, any gathered witnesses and neighbors of the murdered men who could provide any important information were interviewed. Unfortunately, despite the fact that many heard a series of gunshots, no one saw the incident with their own eyes, so they could not give any clues to the investigators. Witnesses described two loud male voices arguing shortly before the massacre began. It sounded as if there was some sort of conflict between the men and the couple that ended in the death of the newlyweds. According to the timeline of events, it happened just after Joseph and Olga returned from the bar. It was Olga's birthday that day, as she turned 39 years old. The newlyweds, friends, and several members of Joe's family gathered for the festivities. They partied and danced until they were tired, and then headed home after midnight. They parked their convertible near the sidewalk of the condominium and headed for the entrance, happy and content, unaware that death literally lurked in front of them. Olga was shot several times in the face, one of the bullets hitting her cheek and exiting the back of her head. Her husband was riddled with bullets, with several shots fired into the body, the fatal one being a hit to the head. While the man was lying in the bushes near the path, with no signs of life, his wife was still fighting for her life and waiting for help. The police officers who arrived while assisting her realized that all hope was on her. They tried to get a name and any hint of the perpetrator by asking questions of the victim, but the woman was unresponsive. I found a large number of bullet casings nearby. This confirmed the possibility that there could have been more than one attacker. There were several different caliber shell casings here, meaning multiple weapons were used. It's unlikely that one perpetrator would have fired different guns, especially since about 25 bullets were fired in total, which means that there were several criminals and they acted for sure. I was also able to confirm that it was not a robbery almost immediately because the victims of the attack were not robbed of anything. They had a wallet with a large amount of cash. The woman had a bag with a phone and valuables, and on her finger was an expensive wedding ring worth several tens of thousands of dollars. After analyzing what happened, I concluded that it was an ambush, a planned crime against the couple. The newlyweds were deliberately stalked near their home and thoroughly riddled with bullets to leave no chance of survival. They seemed to be a nice, happy couple and didn't hurt anyone. But what could be the motive for the crime? As soon as the investigation began, detectives contacted the family of the deceased and interviewed everyone. Police officers spoke to Joe's mother and stepfather. They claimed that the couple had no enemies or ill-wishers who would kill them. At least, they had never heard about it. The couple did not tell them that they had any problems with anyone. But as I told you earlier, everyone close to them knew that Joseph had a conflict with his sister over the ring. So this information, of course, came up when interviewing relatives. Some believed that Kelly had killed the couple over the rocks. Could the sister really harbor a grudge against Joe to the point where she decided to commit a double murder to get back at him? Either way, the ring wasn't missing, which threw that theory out of whack. However, it seemed odd that the dead man's sister, Kelly, had been one of the first on the scene, as if she had been somewhere nearby, even though she lived in a different neighborhood. She was not wearing her face because of the tragedy that had occurred. The sister actively communicated with the investigators, trying to help. Without shyness, she openly told the investigators about the problems with her brother that they had encountered in recent months. The sister did not try to minimize what had happened. She was honest about everything and even showed a correspondence with angry messages they had with each other as well as with Olga. It was obvious from the messages that Joe's wife suspected his sister of robbery, but the latter denied her involvement in the act and also claimed that she was innocent of attacking the couple. Kelly didn't seem to care much for the alibi, but by this point, it had already been confirmed that the assailant was a man and had an accomplice. Detectives also learned that Kelly had long battled breast cancer and had relatively recently undergone extensive treatment while recovering from it. It seemed that the woman did not have the physical strength to accomplish such a thing. But despite this, police still believed that Kelly could somehow be involved in the incident and considered her a suspect, even though all the facts said otherwise. At none of the interrogations was she able to crack. Nevertheless, she remained on the list of suspects for a long time because of the obvious motive, greed. At this stage, detectives were still considering another rather popular version of the murder due to jealousy. Perhaps one of Olga's or Joseph's exes was against their love relationship and wanted to kill a rival or rivaless, or avenged a broken love. Investigators checked the couple's former partners, but none of them aroused suspicion. Olga, except for Joe, had no relationship with anyone in the United States. It is unlikely that some aggrieved ex flew across the ocean for revenge or jealousy. Joe, for his part, had good relationships with his ex-girlfriends, and none of them wished him harm. They were already married and had no views on the happy family man, so this version was ruled out. The puzzle was not so simple, and the investigators puzzled over the culprits of the tragedy. Detectives began to work through other options for the development of events, looking for enemies of the couple in love. However, both were pleasant and friendly people who did not get involved in potentially dangerous stories. Investigators were concerned about a ring that had become a bone of contention between brother and sister. I hypothesized that it could be a strong motive for the crime. Detectives then turned to Joseph's sister's spouse, whose name was Garrett. They believed that he, at Kelly's request, might have committed a double murder because of the ring. However, he had a solid alibi and confirmed the alibi of his wife, who claimed that on the day of the murder, she was not feeling well, resting after procedures. At this juncture, the man brought up the possibility that criminal activity might have played a role in the couple's demise. Garrett, had my doubts about Joseph's wealth being honestly earned, suspecting the deceased was involved in illicit affairs. However, there were witnesses who corroborated this theory. They testified that Joseph was, in fact, selling prohibited steroids from beneath the floor, generating substantial profits. Moreover, some acquaintances cast suspicion on Joe's business partner, Chris Rivers, for the crime. One of his close associates asserted that the latter frequently spoke ill of Joe. On one occasion, he even accused him of embezzlement. This was partly due to the fact that the deceased sold steroids through the general store. Chris had debts, but his partner was in no hurry to share outside income with him and was taking all the money for himself. That's how detectives arrived on the doorstep of Joe's partner, named Chris. At that point, the men had worked together for more than 10 years. Partners literally started their activities together, raised the business from scratch, were very close, went through many difficulties over the years. Instead of a grief-stricken friend, the police encountered a seemingly content Chris, who appeared unconcerned about the events, which struck me as odd. The partner claimed he was supposed to meet the newlyweds at a bar that night, but couldn't make it because he was occupied with business. Chris also brought up numerous rumors surrounding Olga, including her alleged connections with the Russian mafia. This could explain the family's significant income. Chris subtly insinuated that Joe wasn't entirely honest, providing the police with several potential leads to investigate the killers. Despite my suspicions about Chris's honesty, all of this needed thorough investigation. Eventually, a connection between Joseph and the criminal underworld was uncovered, confirmed by several individuals familiar with the man. A couple of years before the marriage, Joe had been imprisoned for illegal possession of weapons. The incident occurred at a bar where a fight broke out, and Joseph brandished a shotgun from his pickup truck, threatening those involved. He never made it into the bar with the weapon, as the police arrived at the parking lot and apprehended the suspicious aggressor. Subsequently convicted, he made new acquaintances during his time in prison. He befriended some individuals who informed him about the steroid trade. Joe didn't forget his newfound connections upon release, so he began participating in the illegal sale of sports performance-enhancing drugs. Joe was involved in criminal schemes, and he was quite a prominent businessman in that field in addition to his main business. However, it was unknown. Could this have been the motive for the murder? Could Joseph have crossed someone's path in this shady business? And could the Russian mobsters who shared business in America really be involved? All of this was up to the detectives to find out. In an effort to identify the organizer or accomplice in this dark enterprise, detectives focused on a man named Harry Cook. He operated within the city and was interested in partnering with Joe in the auto store. By the time of the victims' deaths, he had invested over $100,000 in the business, which could also serve as a motive. Moreover, Harry resided near the Connells, but he had a solid alibi for the time of the attack, leaving the police stumped. Continuing to converse with business partner Chris Rivers, the police uncovered an intriguing detail. The partner repeatedly mentioned his suspicion that his deceased friend was stealing money. The investigation scrutinized the store's financial records, revealing significant losses despite substantial income. Ultimately, it never stayed in the minus. Expenses were escalating rapidly. It seemed highly suspicious. The money was vanishing. It became evident that someone was pilfering funds, but during the investigation, it was revealed that Chris himself was the culprit. In an attempt to understand where the money was going, law enforcement learned of the business partner's opioid addiction. Chris was spending all the money on illegal drugs and was running out of money. It turned out that he had been stealing from the store, and thus from his best friend, in order to acquire illegal substances without hindrance. Thus, there was a new prime suspect who could have a strong motive for committing the crime. It became known that Chris's addiction was already completely out of control. He was using a large number of illegal drugs and could not stop at anything. The partner was in debt, stealing from everyone he could. Lately, he was becoming more and more paranoid. He said that he was being stalked and tried to kill him. In fact, Chris's attempts to cover up the crime caused the police to be suspicious of him. The first time he was arrested for possession of steroids was when he turned in his partner and reported selling them secretly from under the floor of a store. The drugs were located in a machine shop owned by Joe and Chris. He had talked about them himself and referred to his dead friend, who had allegedly sold the drugs through their joint business and had not shared the profits with him. Eventually, it turned out that it wasn't Joe who was selling them, but Chris to cover his debts, which he had taken from serious people. The partner was accused of having a separate room in the auto repair shop for storing steroids, which he organized. The suspect admitted that he had actually organized the business himself out of desperation, and Johnny knew about it. 2 more arrests were later made. At this stage, the police began to be confused by the alibi of the main suspect, Chris. He willingly provided detectives with CCTV footage from outside the house and inside while he was there. They even checked that the time on the recording was not distorted, but the police did not believe him and sensed some kind of trick. Then the detectives checked Chris's cell phone, and it turned out that on the night of the double murder, he was making a lot of calls, much more than usual. The bulk of the calls were made around the time of the attack on the couple. The call log, though deleted on the phone, law enforcement officials had no trouble recovering the call history. Shortly before his business partner was shot dead, his beloved, Chris Rivera, was communicating with a certain Josh Bay. As it turned out, he was a buyer of banned steroids that Chris was distributing. In addition, he ran away with Chris's illegal substances. However, during the investigation, it was proven that Josh Bay did not pull the trigger, but nevertheless could have had something to do with the murder. On that fateful night, there were made several calls by a buddy named Dominic and Aaron. It is likely that these two could have been the people who sentenced the couple. Either way, the picture that emerged was that the victim's business partner was involved in the murder. He had a large debt to pay and a strong motive based on animosity. He could have hired his drug connection, Josh Bay, to eliminate the newlyweds. However, instead of pulling the trigger himself, Bay enlisted 2 of his associates. The plot was becoming increasingly complex. If the hit went smoothly, Chris, Joe's business partner, stood to gain $1 million, the payout from Joe's life insurance policy. Back when they were just starting their business, both partners had similar policies in place. In the event of his partner's demise, Chris could have received a substantial sum, enough to solve his financial woes and settle his debts. But he couldn't claim it now, because his partner had gotten married. Now, following the murder, Olga, Joe's new wife, would receive the full insurance amount, leaving him with nothing. So, Chris Rivers needed to take out both spouses at once, his successful friend and his beautiful wife, to gain sole access to the money. This version was indirectly supported by specific conversations between the mastermind and the accomplices on the night of the double homicide. Joe's partner was constantly texting his drug dealer, Bay, to find out his whereabouts and when he'd be back home. He was clearly worried about the operation's success. The responses were vague. Detectives seized 4 cell phones from the suspects involved in the double murder. The phones' movements were analyzed using the most advanced cellular tracking technology. It was verified that the defendants were in the vicinity of the shooting victims on September 23, 2013. The direct perpetrators, Dominic and Aaron, were tracked near the Connell's home. Bay, who orchestrated the events, was in constant contact with his client, Chris, elsewhere. The CCTV footage, which the prime suspect relied on to support his alibi, didn't exactly work in his favor. They noted the strange behavior of the business partner as he nervously paced in his apartment, constantly clutching his phone. He was obviously awaiting a response from the hitman and was communicating with him. All of this began to be confirmed quite quickly. Josh Bay himself was particularly instrumental in the investigation when he surrendered to the police and agreed to a plea deal for leniency. According to Bay, Chris had, in fact, asked him to kill his auto store partner and his spouse. As payment, he immediately provided a deposit of $5,000 and promised an additional $60,000 after Joe and Olga were dead. As part of the plea deal, Bay testified against Chris in court. A year after the brutal murders, Chris Rivers was charged with conspiracy to commit double homicide. The other defendants in the case also went to trial. The hearings commenced 19 months after the investigation began. Chris's plan didn't work, even though he'd thought it through pretty well. He hoped the investigation would get sidetracked and go in the wrong direction. To this end, several potential leads were suggested. The victim's involvement in steroid sales, his past, robberies that had occurred shortly before the tragedy, and a feud with his sister. All of these could have confused the police, and they could have ended up arresting someone else. Fortunately, law enforcement saw through the deception and got on the trail of the Real killers. The police were able to prove that the robbery at the murdered men's home was staged before the crime. It was also committed by Bay. Chris instructed him to break into the Connell's house. His primary task was to locate and steal a diamond engagement ring. In that case, law enforcement would have definitely considered Kelly's sister as the main suspect in the subsequent murder. However, the jewelry couldn't be found among the couple's belongings, so the plan failed. During the trials, which were held separately and concurrently for the criminals, Aaron Thompson confessed and received 2 life sentences on the double murder charges, plus 45 years when it was proven that he was the one who held the gun. Chris Rivers also received 2 life sentences plus 50 years because he was the instigator of the crime. His accomplice, Dominic Benton, was acquitted of the murder charge. He didn't shoot the couple, but he was convicted of conspiracy and aiding and abetting the criminals. Dominic was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Josh Bay was sentenced to only 5 years for his active cooperation with the police. The victim's sister, Kelly, was severely affected by the situation. At one point, the police put pressure on her to try to implicate her in her own brother's murder and nearly put an innocent woman behind bars. However, she couldn't have gone through with a double murder. Of course, she was upset by her mother and brother's actions with the wedding ring, but it was nothing more than an excuse for insults and verbal altercations. At the funeral, the sister confessed that she loved her brother very much and grieved alongside all her loved ones for the loss. If you enjoyed my work, subscribe to the channel, support this video with a like, and let's discuss this story in the comments. I recommend watching these videos. Thank you all and bye.